I'm not asking your permission to love you. I'm telling you, I already do.
The ring box hit the floor before he understood why his hand had opened. That was how it started. Not with a name, not with a scene, with a sound he hadn't heard in 15 years, carried across a jewelry gallery he'd walked into to plan a wedding to a woman he didn't love. Karma doesn't announce itself. It waits until you've stopped looking for it, then it laughs in a voice you'd know anywhere. Justice doesn't always arrive with a verdict. Sometimes it arrives holding a teenager's hand, asking about a watch repair, having no idea it just stopped a man's heart from 20 feet away. However you're listening to this, wherever you are, whatever the weather looks like outside your window right now, settle in. This is one you're going to want to see through to the end, and there's a lot of end to get to. His name was Doyun Kang. This is the story of how a man who ran one of the most feared organizations in Busan, a man who had learned by the age of 10 never to let his face show what he was feeling, lost every ounce of that control in the space it takes to drop a diamond. If you're new here, consider subscribing before we go further. You're going to want to know what happens next. But let's start from the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. Doyun was 23 the first time he saw Imani Carter. He believed, back then, in the kind of things a young man believes in before life has had the chance to correct him. He believed that if you loved someone enough, it didn't matter what your father wanted for you. He believed loyalty ran both directions, that the organization his family had built could bend around one exception if the exception mattered enough. He believed Imani, a physical therapist who'd moved to Busan for a 2-year contract and never left, was going to be his exception. He was wrong about all of it, though it would take him 15 years to understand exactly how wrong and exactly whose hands had done the correcting. Imani had grown up in Atlanta, the daughter of a nurse and a man who fixed engines for a living, and she had never once in her life imagined loving a man whose family required armed men outside restaurants. She used to tell Doyun that love was supposed to be simple, that if it required this much hiding, this much explaining, this much looking over your shoulder, it probably wasn't love at all. It was just fear wearing love's clothes. He used to tell her she was wrong. He spent 15 years finding out she'd been right. She was 24 when they fell into each other, careless in the way only two people who don't yet know what the world can take from them are able to be. She believed, the way people that age believe things, that he would choose her, that when it came down to his father's plans and her open hands, he'd pick the open hands. That belief cost her more than she ever let her sons know. Now hold on to that, because here is where the story turns cruel in a way neither of them saw coming, and you're going to want dramatic proof of it before this act is even finished. 15 years later, on an ordinary afternoon that Doyun had scheduled down to the last detail, he stood in a private fitting room at Hanol Jewelry, being shown a ring meant for a woman named Yuna Beek, a woman he had met exactly 4 times and did not love. In a marriage his father had assembled like a business merger, because that, to Kang Seok-min, was exactly what it was. He said the words that were expected of him, "Wrap it," and for one more moment, his life continued exactly the way it had for 15 years, arranged, contained, correct. Then he heard someone laugh outside the room, and something in his chest recognized it before his mind caught up. He looked toward the entrance. A woman walked past with 2 teenage boys at her sides, one pointing toward a display case, the other laughing at something she'd said. She hadn't seen him yet. He had maybe 4 seconds where he could have stayed exactly where he was, said nothing, let her walk out of the gallery and back into whatever life she'd built without him. He didn't take them. The box slipped from his hand. The diamond rolled across the floor and came to rest against the toe of his shoe, and not one person in that room, not his assistant, not the store manager frozen mid-sentence, understood why the most controlled man any of them had ever worked for suddenly looked like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Imani turned. Their eyes met across a room full of strangers, and 15 years collapsed into the length of a single breath. She recognized the 2 teenage boys weren't the only thing about to complicate his life beyond repair. She recognized him. And in that half-second before either of them said a single word, before the questions started, before his father's plans, before Ha-jun Oh's name had even entered this story, one thought moved through Doyun Kang with the force of a verdict already handed down. 15 years, two boys who stood exactly the height he had at their age, and a debt he hadn't known he owed, standing in front of him, about to demand payment. Before there was a jewelry gallery, before there were two teenage boys who carried his eyes without knowing it, there was a rooftop clinic in a converted building near the Busan harbor, and a 23-year-old physical therapist who had no idea the man on her table was the son of Kang Seok-min. Doyun had torn something in his shoulder during a training session he wasn't supposed to be at, in a gym his father didn't know he still used, and the referral had landed him on Imani's schedule 3 Tuesdays in a row. She didn't know who he was. He didn't correct her assumption that he worked in shipping logistics, which was technically true, in the way a lot of things about his family's business were technically true. She talked to him like a person instead of a name. He hadn't realized how much he needed that until it was already happening to him. By the 4th week, the appointments had stopped being about his shoulder. She'd grown up watching her mother work double shifts and her father come home smelling like motor oil, and she carried an idea of love that had nothing to do with money or protection or power. She thought love looked like someone showing up, telling the truth, staying when staying was hard. Doyun had never met anyone who believed that so plainly, without irony, without a transaction hidden underneath it. Everyone in his life wanted something from him. She wanted him to eat before their walks got too long, and to stop checking his phone every 4 minutes, and that was the whole list. He started telling her things. Not everything, not at first, but real things. That his father had decided his path for him before he was old enough to have an opinion about it. That the confidence people saw when he walked into a room was something he'd built the way you build a wall, one brick at a time, to keep people from seeing what was actually behind it. She told him that was the loneliest thing she'd ever heard, and she said it without pity, which was the only reason he let her keep saying things like that to him. He told her the truth about his family 7 months in, sitting in her small apartment near the harbor, watching her decide in real time whether to be afraid of him. She wasn't, not of him. She was afraid of what came attached to him, which she made clear was a very different thing. "I need you to understand what you'd be signing up for," he told her. "I need you to understand I already decided," she said back. "I'm not asking your permission to love you, I'm telling you I already do." He believed, hearing that he'd found something his father's entire organization couldn't touch. Kang Seok-min found out about her 4 months later and made it clear immediately that he considered her a liability with a heartbeat. Doyun brought her to dinner exactly once, against every instinct telling him not to. His father was courteous in the specific way that meant something else entirely, asking Imani about her family, her plans, how long she intended to stay in Korea, questions that sounded like curiosity and functioned like an inventory. Afterward, alone with his son, Seok-min didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "She's not built for this life," his father said, "and this life is not built to bend for her. You will end this before it becomes a liability neither of us can afford." "I'm not ending it." "Then you'll learn what it costs to keep it." His father said this the way he said everything, calm, final, already 3 moves ahead. "Everything in this family has a price, Doyun, even the things you think are free." Doyun walked out of that conversation believing he'd won something, because his father hadn't forbidden it outright, hadn't threatened Imani directly, hadn't done anything Doyun could point to and call a war. He didn't yet understand that his father rarely fought wars anyone could see coming. Seok-min preferred quieter methods. He preferred outcomes that looked, from the outside, like nobody's fault at all. For the better part of a year after that dinner, Doyun and Imani lived in something close to happiness, careful, guarded, but real. He introduced her to the parts of Busan that mattered to him and none of the parts that didn't. She started teaching him things about her own life in return, about Atlanta, about the church her grandmother had dragged her to every Sunday, about a version of family that didn't run on obligation. He started imagining, quietly, a future that had never once occurred to him as available. What neither of them noticed, because neither of them had any reason to look for it, was Ha-Jun-Oh. Oh ran a rival faction that had been circling Kang territory for 2 years by then, looking for the one weakness Doyun's organization hadn't yet learned to protect. Seokmin knew about Oh's interest before his son did. What Seokmin understood, and what would take Doyun 15 years and a jewelry gallery to uncover, was that a father looking to end his son's relationship and a rival looking for leverage over the Kang family had, without ever meeting, arrived at the exact same solution. Neither of them needed Doyun to lose the woman he loved. They needed her to disappear in a way that would look, forever after, like her own choice. By the time Doyun was 24, he'd started talking about a future with Imani that included a wedding his father would never sanction and a life his organization would never allow. He told her, one night by the water, that no matter what happened, no matter what his family threw between them, he would find a way to make it work. "I'll always find you," he told her, "no matter what happens." She believed him completely. Neither of them knew, standing there, that the promise was already being dismantled by two men neither of them had any reason to suspect were working, in their own separate and unconnected ways, toward the exact same ending. The night everything changed started like any other, which is exactly how the worst nights usually start. Doyun was 25. He and Imani had been together 2 years by then, long enough that he'd stopped hiding her existence from the parts of his life he could control and had started quietly making plans for the parts he couldn't. He'd found an apartment near the harbor, close to her clinic, far enough from his father's house that it felt like the beginning of something separate. He hadn't told her yet. He wanted it to be a surprise. He never got the chance. His father called him into a meeting that ran until 2 in the morning, one of dozens that month, negotiations with a shipping partner that had gone sideways and needed careful handling. Doyun's phone had been off for the entire meeting, per his father's standing rule, no exceptions, not even for family. When he turned it back on, there were 9 missed calls from Imani and 1 voicemail, her voice tight with something he'd never heard from her before. By the time he reached her apartment, it was empty. Not ransacked, not disturbed, just empty, the way a place looks when someone has packed with care and left on purpose. There was a letter on the counter, in her handwriting, though he wouldn't learn until 15 years later exactly how much of what it said hadn't come from her at all. The letter told him she was leaving Korea, that she'd realized she couldn't keep living a life built around hiding, around being an inconvenience his family tolerated rather than accepted, that she was sorry, that she loved him, but that loving him wasn't enough to build a future on, not with everything standing between them. He read it 4 times, standing in her empty kitchen, before he understood it wasn't going to change, no matter how many times he read it. What the letter didn't say, because Imani hadn't written a single word of it, was that 2 men had visited her that same afternoon while Doyun sat trapped in a meeting his father had scheduled with unusual precision that particular week. The first was one of Seokmin's men, a quiet fixer named Taeyang who specialized in problems that needed to disappear without leaving fingerprints. He came with money, a significant amount, and a story he'd been coached to deliver with total conviction, that Doyun had accepted an arranged engagement his father had been negotiating for months, that Doyun had asked personally for her to be paid to leave quietly so there wouldn't be a scene. Taeyang was good at his job. He made it sound like mercy. Imani didn't believe it at first. She told him to get out of her apartment, told him she'd hear it from Doyun himself before she believed a word of it. That was when the second visitor arrived. Ha-Jun-Oh didn't come with money, he came with a folder. Inside it were photographs and documents Oh's people had spent months compiling, evidence tying Doyun to a violent conflict 2 years earlier between the Kang organization and a rival faction. A conflict that had left 3 men dead and that Doyun had played a direct role in, following his father's orders in a war he hadn't started and couldn't refuse. Oh explained, calmly, that if Imani stayed, if she made herself a permanent fixture in Doyun's life, he would make sure that evidence found its way to the authorities, wrapped in enough proof to guarantee Doyun spent the rest of his life in prison. "I have no interest in destroying him tonight," Oh told her, in a voice that made the threat feel almost reasonable. "But you being here makes him careless, and a careless man is a man I can use against his father eventually. Leave, and none of this ever surfaces. Stay, and I promise you this ends with him in a cell and you standing in the wreckage of it, wondering what you could have done differently." She had 2 years of loving Doyun Wade against a folder of evidence she had no way to verify and no time to question. She had no proof it wasn't real. She had a story from his father's own man that lined up disturbingly well with a proposal she vaguely recalled a business associate mentioning once. And she had, underneath all of it, a growing fear that had nothing to do with either man in her apartment and everything to do with a small, private discovery she hadn't told Doyun about yet. She was pregnant, and she had no idea, standing in that kitchen, that it was twins. She left that night believing she was protecting him. She believed, with the strange, brutal clarity of someone who has just been handed the worst version of a story and no way to check it, that walking away was the only thing she could do that wouldn't end with Doyun in prison and their child growing up visiting him through glass. She told herself it was an act of love. 15 years later, standing in a jewelry gallery, she would still believe that, right up until the moment someone finally told her the truth. Doyun searched for her for 6 months with a desperation his father found deeply inconvenient. He hired people. He called contacts in shipping and immigration who owed him favors. He found nothing because Hajun Oh had made certain of that, and because his father had quietly redirected every search Doyun's people conducted, one dead end at a time, without ever once telling his son he was doing it. Eventually Doyun stopped searching, not because he'd given up, but because his father convinced him, slowly, patiently, over the better part of a year, that a woman who leaves in the night without a goodbye is a woman who has already made her choice, and chasing her further was chasing his own humiliation. He believed that lie for 15 years. Now in the present, standing in the middle of Hanol jewelry with a diamond at his feet and 2 teenage boys watching him like he was a stranger who somehow already mattered, none of that history had surfaced yet. He didn't know about Tiyang. He didn't know about the folder. He didn't know his own father had spent 15 years making certain he never would. He only knew that the woman in front of him had asked him once to always find her, and that somewhere in the last 15 years he had stopped trying. He managed, and couldn't finish the sentence. "It's been a long time," Imani said, calm in a way that cost her everything to maintain. Behind him, his phone buzzed. His father's name lit the screen, 3 words in the notification preview that told him everything about how this was going to go the moment his family found out. "Where are you?" He put the phone back in his pocket without answering, and for the first time in 15 years, Doyun Kang chose something his father had no say in at all. Kang Seok-min learned about the jewelry gallery before his son had even made it back to his car. The store manager, terrified of the scene and desperate to smooth things over with a family whose displeasure had a way of ending careers, called ahead to Seok-min's assistant within minutes. By the time Doyun walked into his father's office that evening, Seok-min already knew everything: the dropped ring, the cancelled meeting, the woman, the boys, all of it laid out on his desk like a report from a war he thought he'd won 15 years ago. "You're going to tell me this was a coincidence," Seok-min said, not looking up from the documents in front of him. "I'm not telling you anything. I don't answer to you for this." His father set the papers down slowly, the way he did whenever he wanted a room to understand that patience was a choice he was making, not a trait he possessed. "You answer to this family for everything. That has never changed, no matter how much time passes or how convincingly you've started to believe otherwise. 15 years, and you've never once asked why she left. Because it doesn't matter why. She's gone. She made her choice." Doyun studied his father's face for a long moment, looking for something he couldn't name yet, a flicker, a tell, anything that would explain the strange stillness in Seok-min's eyes whenever the subject of Imani came up. He didn't find it that night. He would, eventually, not yet. The Han Beek arrangement stands, his father continued. Yuna Beek's family expects a wedding date within the month. You will not embarrass this family over a woman who left you without so much as a phone call. Doyun didn't answer. He walked out instead, which was, in its own way, an answer. Yuna Beek heard about the incident at the gallery from her own family before Doyun ever spoke to her directly, and her reaction surprised everyone who expected her to be devastated. She wasn't. If anything, something in her chest loosened for the first time in weeks. Yuna was 26, sharp in a way her family found useful and occasionally inconvenient, and she had agreed to the arrangement with Doyun for reasons that had very little to do with romance and everything to do with a business her father's holdings desperately needed shored up. She'd met Doyun 4 times. She found him distant, competent, and entirely uninterested in her, which suited her fine because she was equally uninterested in him. What she hadn't told her family, what she'd barely admitted to herself, was that she'd been quietly seeing someone else for the better part of a year, a man her father would never approve of, and the arrangement with Doyun had felt, until this week, like a door closing on any version of her life that included him. She requested a private meeting with Doyun 3 days after the gallery, and when he arrived expecting an argument, she surprised him with something closer to relief. "I'm not going to pretend I'm heartbroken," she told him. "I don't think either of us wanted this marriage. I think we both agreed to it because our families needed it to happen and neither of us had a good enough reason to say no. That's an honest thing to say to the man you're supposed to be marrying." "I'd rather be honest with you than married to you," she said. "Whoever she is, whatever happened, I don't think either of us should spend the rest of our lives paying for our parents' arrangements. I have my own reasons for wanting this to fall apart. You just gave me the opening I needed." It wasn't friendship yet, but it was the beginning of something neither of them expected, an alliance built on mutual relief rather than romance, and it would matter more than either of them understood in the weeks ahead. Across the city, Imani was fighting a different kind of pressure. Daniel and David, she'd started thinking of them by full names again lately, the way she had when they were small enough to need correcting, had gone quiet in the specific way teenagers go quiet when they've decided their questions aren't welcome. She'd caught them searching Doyun's name online twice that week. She hadn't stopped them. She wasn't sure she had the right to. "You don't have to tell us everything," Malik said to her one evening, careful in the way he'd learned to be careful with her. "But you have to tell us something. We're not kids anymore." "I know that." "Then why does it feel like you're still protecting us from something that already happened?" She didn't have a good answer for that, not one she trusted herself to give without breaking down in front of them, so she gave them the only true thing she could offer. "Because some of it, I still don't understand myself. I thought I did. I'm starting to think I got a lot of it wrong." Kofi looked up from his phone. "Wrong how?" "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'm going to find out." She wasn't the only one starting to ask questions. Grace Carter, Imani's older sister, had flown in from Atlanta the week after the gallery, ostensibly to help with the boys' schedules while Imani's world rearranged itself, though both women knew the visit was really about the conversation neither of them had had in 15 years. "You never told me everything about that night," Grace said one evening, watching Imani fold laundry with more focus than laundry required. "You told me you left him. You never told me why, not really, just that some men came by and you knew you had to go." Imani's hands stilled over a shirt she'd already folded twice. "I was scared," she said finally. "I believed I didn't have a choice." "Scared of what, exactly?" The question sat there long enough that Imani realized she'd never actually answered it for herself, not once in 15 years, not honestly. She'd told herself a story about protecting Doyun, about protecting the Barbies she hadn't even known were twins yet, and she'd repeated that story to herself so many times it had calcified into something she'd stopped examining. "I don't actually know anymore," she said quietly. "I believed things that night that I never checked. I just believed them and I ran." Grace didn't say anything else that evening, but something in her expression suggested she was turning a memory over in her own mind, something from around that same time that had never quite made sense to her either. Ren Park found Doyun in his office past midnight, 3 days after the confrontation with Yuna, going through old organizational records with the kind of focus he usually reserved for threats to the family's territory. "What are we looking for?" Ren asked, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected. "Anything from 15 years ago, any operation, any payment, anything that touches the month she disappeared." Ren hesitated long enough that Doyun looked up from the files. "You know something. I know that your father ran 3 off-book payments that month that never made it into the standard ledgers," Ren said carefully. "I was junior then. I filed the paperwork without asking questions because that's what you did back then. I never connected it to anything until you just said her name." Doyun's hands went still over the desk. "I need to see those records. They were sealed. Your father sealed a lot of things around that time." "Then unseal them," Doyun said, and for the first time since the gallery, something other than grief moved through his voice. "I want to know exactly what my father did 15 years ago, and I want to know why he spent 15 years making sure I never asked." Outside the window, Ha-jun-oh sat 2 blocks away in a parked car, watching a different building entirely, one belonging to Imani's apartment complex. Patient in the way a man is patient when he believes he's already won a war nobody else knows is still being fought. He'd heard about the gallery within a day of it happening. He'd spent 15 years assuming that particular loose end had stayed tied. He was already deciding, watching the lit windows of an apartment where a mother was trying to explain 15 years to 2 sons who deserved better than half a truth, exactly how much it would cost him to make sure it stayed that way. The sealed records took Ren 4 days to fully unlock, and what they contained was worse than either of them had prepared for. 3 payments, each routed through shell accounts tied to logistics contracts that didn't exist, all processed within the same 72-hour window 15 years ago. 1 payment to a fixer named Tiang, whose name Doyun recognized immediately, a man his father had used for exactly the kind of work that required no paper trail and no witnesses left standing to talk about it. 1 payment to a property management company that, cross-referenced against old leases, had quietly covered 6 months of rent on an apartment in a city 3 hours from Busan under a name that wasn't Imani's, but matched every other detail Ren could verify. And 1 payment that made Doyun's stomach turn in a way none of the others had, a wire transfer, dated the same week, to an account belonging to a faction Doyun's organization had been at open war with 15 years earlier. Ha-jun-oh's faction. "I don't understand," Doyun said, staring at the records like they might rearrange themselves into something less true. "Why would my father pay a rival faction anything, let alone that week?" "I don't think he paid O to do something," Ren said slowly, working it through as he spoke. "I think he paid to make sure O did nothing to stop whatever your father was already doing. I think your father and O wanted the same outcome that week, for completely different reasons, and somehow they made sure they weren't stepping on each other's plans." Doyun sat with that for a long moment, the full shape of it assembling itself piece by piece in a way that made him feel 15 years younger and infinitely more foolish. "My father didn't just let her leave," he said finally. "He paid people to make sure she did, and O let him because it served O too. That's what the records say." Doyun stood so fast his chair hit the wall behind him. "Get me everything, every document, every account, every name attached to any of this. I want it all before I confront him." Imani got her own version of the truth 2 days later, and it arrived through a much smaller door than Doyun's had. Grace had spent the week quietly making calls, following a thread that had been bothering her since the conversation about laundry and folded shirts. She remembered, now that she was really looking at it, a strange visit from a well-dressed man to Imani's apartment building the week before Imani left Korea, a man Grace had seen only once, in passing, on a video call where Imani had briefly turned her camera toward the window. Grace hadn't thought about it in 15 years. She thought about almost nothing else now. She tracked down a former building manager, retired and willing to talk for the price of a decent dinner, who confirmed 2 visitors had come to Imani's apartment the night she disappeared, not one. A quiet man who came and went within 20 minutes. And a second man, more composed, who stayed almost an hour and left carrying nothing, which the manager remembered specifically because most people who visited that building left with something, a box, a bag, some evidence of the business that had brought them there. This man had left with only his own certainty intact. Grace brought what she'd found to Imani that evening, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, while the twins did homework in the next room, deliberately keeping her voice low. "I don't think you left because you wanted to," Grace said. "I think somebody made very sure you believed you had to." Imani's hands, which had been perfectly steady all week, started to shake. "2 men," Grace continued. "One paying you off on somebody's behalf, one threatening you with something, I don't know what yet, but something serious enough that a 24-year-old woman who was completely in love with a man packed her whole life into 2 suitcases in one night and never looked back." "I remember the folder," Imani said quietly, the words coming out like something she'd kept buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it hadn't happened the way she remembered. "Photographs, documents. He said Doyun would go to prison if I stayed. He said it so calmly. I never once asked to see it again in daylight. I never once asked anyone else if it was real. Because you were 24 and terrified and pregnant, and somebody handed you exactly the story that would make you run." Imani put her head in her hands. 15 years of a story she'd told herself, a story about sacrifice and protection and choosing her children over a man who couldn't choose her back, and none of it, had been entirely her own choice to make. "He didn't leave me," she whispered. "I left him because someone made sure I would." "I think that's exactly right. He searched for me, Grace. He told me once he'd always find me, and I let myself believe he'd stopped trying because that was easier than believing someone had stopped him." From the next room, Malik's voice carried through, asking Kofi something about a math problem, ordinary and unaware that the entire architecture of their family's history had just shifted under their mother's feet. Imani looked toward that doorway, toward 2 boys who had grown up asking careful questions about a father-shaped absence she'd never fully explained, and something in her chest that had been guarded for 15 years finally, quietly, broke open. "I have to tell them," she said, "and I have to talk to him, really talk to him, not across a coffee table with 15 years of armor still on." "What about the second man, the one who threatened you? You still don't know who that was?" Imani went still. She hadn't thought about that question yet, not really, too consumed by the shape of her own 15-year mistake to consider that the second man, the one with the folder, might still be out there, might still consider her a loose end worth managing. She didn't know yet how right she was to worry. 2 miles away, in a parked car outside her apartment building, Ha-Jun-oh watched the lit kitchen window and made a decision of his own. He'd assumed, for 15 years, that this particular story had stayed buried. Now Doyun Kang was pulling sealed financial records, and Grace Carter was tracking down retired building managers, and if either thread led back far enough, it would eventually arrive at his name. He picked up his phone and made a call he'd hoped never to need to make again. "It's O," he said, when the line connected. "We have a problem from 15 years ago that's about to become a very current one. I need you to make sure Imani Carter and her sons understand exactly how much they still have to lose. Whatever happens next between Doyun and Imani, understand this. The truth they just uncovered wasn't the end of the danger. It was the beginning of a much more dangerous one, and neither of them saw it coming yet. If you want to know how far O is willing to go to bury a 15-year-old secret, stay close, because the next part of this story does not slow down." Doyun confronted his father the morning after Ren finished compiling the records, and it went nothing like he'd imagined. He'd pictured his father denying it, or deflecting, or reaching for one of the calm, patient explanations Seokmin used to reframe every hard truth into something reasonable. Instead, his father sat behind his desk, looked at the documents Doyun spread in front of him, and didn't bother denying a single line. "You did this," Doyun said. "You paid a fixer to run her off. You paid rent on an apartment to make sure she had somewhere to disappear to. You coordinated with Ha Jun-oh, a man who had killed people close to this family, because it served you both to have her gone." "Yes," Seok-min said simply. The single word landed harder than any denial could have. 15 years, Doyun said. 15 years, you let me believe she chose to leave. You let me believe I'd stopped mattering enough to look for. I let you believe what kept you functional, what kept this family functional. You were 25 and reckless with a woman who was going to get you killed or arrested, and I did what a father does when his son can't yet see the difference between love and liability. She was pregnant. For the first time, something shifted in his father's expression, a flicker of genuine surprise, quickly buried. "I didn't know that." "Would it have mattered?" Seok-min didn't answer right away, and the silence told Doyun everything he needed to know. "You have 2 grandsons, Doyun said, quiet now, quieter than the rage building underneath it. 15 years of grandsons you've never met, because you decided a woman who loved me was a problem to be solved instead of a person to be honest with. I did what was necessary. You destroyed something because it was inconvenient, and you called it necessary so you wouldn't have to call it cruel." Doyun walked out that morning, having already decided something his father hadn't anticipated. He wasn't interested in revenge through the organization's usual channels. He was interested in something his father had never had to fear from him before: public accountability, on Doyun's terms, in front of everyone the Kang name still commanded respect from. He should have moved faster. Imani sat her sons down that same week and told them everything, or as much of everything as a mother can tell 2 15-year-olds without breaking something in them that shouldn't be broken. She told them about Doyun, about the life she'd believed she had to leave, about the threats and the folder and 15 years of a story built on a lie she hadn't questioned nearly enough. Malik took it quietly, the way he took most things, turning it over in careful silence before he finally spoke. "So he didn't leave us. Somebody made you believe he did." "That's what I think happened, yes." "Does that mean we're supposed to just, let him in now, after everything?" "It means you get to decide that for yourselves. Both of you. I'm not going to make that choice for you the way somebody once made it for me." Kofi had been quieter than his brother, staring at his hands through most of it, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way that undid something in Imani's chest. "I used to think it was our fault, that maybe if we'd been different, he would have come looking harder." "No," Imani said immediately, fierce in a way she rarely let herself be. "None of this was ever about you, not 1 second of it." She meant every word. She had no idea, saying it, how quickly that promise was about to be tested. The message arrived 2 nights later, delivered not to Imani's phone, but slipped under the apartment door sometime after midnight, no name attached, no return address, just a single photograph and 4 lines of text. The photograph showed Malik and Kofi walking home from school the previous afternoon, taken from across the street, close enough to see the logos on their backpacks. The text was short: "Some debts don't expire after 15 years. Keep your sons close and keep quiet about what you and Doyun think you've discovered. This is the only warning you'll receive." Imani read it standing in her kitchen at 1 in the morning, and for the second time in 15 years, felt the exact same cold certainty she'd felt the night she packed 2 suitcases and disappeared. She called Doyun before she'd even fully decided to. He answered on the first ring. "Someone's watching my sons," she said, and her voice, steady through everything else this month had thrown at her, finally broke. "Someone left a photograph under my door. They know about the records. They know what you and Ren found." Doyun was already reaching for his coat before she finished the sentence. "I'm coming to you. Don't open the door for anyone else tonight." "Doyun," she said his name the way she used to say it, 15 years ago, before either of them had learned how much a name could cost. I'm scared, not for me, for them. I know I'm not going to let anything happen to either of you. I should have said that 15 years ago and meant it enough to fight for it. I'm saying it now. He arrived at her apartment 40 minutes later, having driven without security for the second time in a month, and found her sitting at the kitchen table with the photograph in front of her and both boys awake, refusing to go back to bed until they understood what was happening. This was the first real conversation Doyun had with his sons, not across a jewelry gallery, not at a soccer match watched from a careful distance, but sitting at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning, explaining to two 15-year-olds that a war from before they were born had just reached forward and put its hand on their shoulders. "Is this because of you?" Malik asked, not unkindly, just direct in the way his mother had raised him to be. "It's because of choices people made before either of you existed," Doyun said. "But yes, it's connected to me, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise because you've had enough people lie to you already." Kofi studied him for a long moment. "What are you going to do about it?" Doyun looked at Imani, then back at his son, and something in his chest settled into a decision he'd been circling for weeks without quite landing on it. "I'm going to make sure the people responsible for this can't hide behind anyone's silence anymore, mine included." He didn't yet know exactly what that would cost him, how much of his father's organization would turn against him for choosing exposure over containment, or how close Ha-jun-oh was willing to bring his own war to Imani's front door before this was finished. He only knew, sitting in that kitchen with his sons watching him with the same careful eyes their mother had once turned on him 15 years ago, that he had already lost 15 years to other people's decisions. He wasn't losing what came next the same way. Outside, unseen, a car idled at the end of the block for exactly 4 minutes before pulling away, and whoever sat inside it had already seen everything they needed to see. Doyun didn't sleep that night, and by morning he'd made a decision that would put him at odds with almost everyone who'd ever answered to him. He called Ren Park before dawn. "I need everything organized into something that can't be buried," he said. "Every payment, every name, every connection between my father and O. I'm not handling this quietly anymore. Quiet is what let this go 15 years without anyone answering for it." "You understand what you're asking," Ren said carefully. "If you go public with this, even within the organization, your father won't just be embarrassed. People will start questioning whether he's fit to lead anything. Some of them will come looking to you as the alternative. Others will side with him out of habit. You'll be starting something you can't fully control." "I know exactly what I'm starting. And oh, if we expose the connection between him and your father, he won't sit quietly and let that happen. He's already threatening Imani's sons over a 15-year-old secret. What do you think he does when that secret's about to become public?" Doyun had turned that exact question over most of the night. "He escalates, which is why I need to move faster than he expects, not slower." Yuna Beek came to him 2 days later with something he hadn't asked for and hadn't expected, an offer to help. "My family has business interests that intersect with O's people," she told him, in the same direct voice she'd used to end their engagement without ceremony. "I've heard things over the years I never had a reason to repeat because they never touched anything I cared about. They touch this now. Why would you put yourself in the middle of this? We're not engaged anymore. You don't owe me anything." "Because you gave me my freedom back without making me fight you for it," she said, "and because the man I've actually been seeing for the past year happens to be someone O's organization has leaned on before, I have more reason than you think to want him weakened." She paused. "Also, for what it's worth, I've met your sons exactly once at the football match from a distance. They looked like boys who deserve a father who isn't hiding behind an inherited empire. I'd like to help make sure they get one." It wasn't romance. It was something rarer between two people who'd nearly been forced to marry each other, a genuine alliance built on mutual respect and matching reasons to want the same outcome. Imani faced her own version of the impossible choice that same week, though hers had nothing to do with organizations or evidence. Malik found her on the balcony one evening, staring out at a city she'd once fled without a backward glance. "You could still run," he said quietly. "I heard you and Aunt Grace talking. You could take us somewhere none of this reaches. It's not the first time you've done it." "I could," she admitted. "It would probably even work for a while." "But you're not going to." "No," she said. "I spent 15 years running from a threat I never fully understood, believing that was the same thing as protecting you. I watched what it cost all three of us, wondering, guessing, filling in the silence with worse things than the truth probably deserved. I'm not doing that again. Whatever happens next, we're going to face it standing still together with the truth in front of us instead of behind us. Even if it's dangerous." "Especially then," she said. "Running from danger you don't understand isn't safety, baby. It's just delay. I finally understand what we're actually facing. That matters more than I can explain to you right now." Malik was quiet for a long moment, watching the same skyline his mother was. "For what it's worth," he said eventually, "I don't hate him. Kofi doesn't either, not really, even if he acts like he does sometimes. We just don't know how to be someone's son when we've spent our whole lives being fine without one. You don't have to know yet. Nobody expects you to have that figured out in 3 weeks." "Does he expect it?" Imani thought about Doyun sitting at their kitchen table at 2 in the morning, telling 2 teenagers the truth, instead of managing them the way his family had spent generations managing everyone around them. "No," she said, "I don't think he does. I think he's just trying to earn the chance to find out, the same slow way anyone else would have to." 2 nights before the engagement ceremony, his father still hadn't officially cancelled. Doyun met with Ren and Yuna in a small office above one of the Kang organization's shipping fronts, the 3 of them assembling the last pieces of what would become, within 48 hours, either his family's reckoning or his own downfall. "This is the choice," Ren said, laying the final compiled file on the table between them. "Bring this forward quietly, through channels your father still controls, and risk him burying it the way he's buried everything else for 15 years. Or bring it forward publicly, in front of both families and enough witnesses that no one can make it disappear, and risk everything that comes with declaring war on your own father in front of people who have spent their lives fearing him." Doyun looked at the file for a long moment, thinking of a diamond rolling across a marble floor, of 2 boys introducing themselves with careful, practiced politeness in a jewelry gallery, of a promise he'd made by a river 15 years ago that he'd finally get the chance to keep. "Publicly," he said, "I spent 15 years letting my father decide what stayed hidden. That ends now, in front of everyone who ever had to fear him the way I did." Yuna nodded slowly. "Then we do it at the ceremony. Everyone who matters will already be in the same room. Your father won't see it coming until it's already happening, which means he won't have time to control how it lands. And we'll find out the moment your father does," Ren said grimly. "Which means after tonight, we're not just exposing a 15-year-old secret. We're removing whatever protection Imani and the boys have had from staying invisible to him. He'll know exactly where to find them and exactly how much he's about to lose." Doyun closed the file, his decision already made, already costing more than he could fully calculate yet. "Then we make sure they're protected before a single word of this becomes public," he said. "Whatever it takes. I'm not losing them again to protect a secret that was never mine to keep quiet in the first place." Outside, the ceremony hall was already being prepared for an event that was about to become something none of the guests, and certainly not Kang Seok-min, ever saw coming. The engagement hall filled the way these things always did in families like the Kangs, with careful seating charts and careful smiles, and enough quiet money in the room to buy several small countries. Kang Seok-min stood near the front, greeting the Beek family with the composed warmth of a man who believed, right up until the last possible moment, that he still controlled every outcome in the room. He didn't know Doyun had arrived early. He didn't know Ren had already positioned 2 former employees willing to testify in front of witnesses to exactly what they'd been asked to file away and forget 15 years ago. He didn't know Beek, technically still his son's fiancée on paper for another few hours, had spent the last 3 days quietly making sure her own family's guests understood there would be no wedding announced tonight, regardless of what the invitations said. He didn't know Imani was already in the building, seated toward the back with Grace on one side and her sons on the other. They're not to hide this time, but to watch. Doyun found his father near the front of the hall 20 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. "It's not too late to reconsider," Seokmin said, mistaking his son's calm for hesitation. "Whatever happened 15 years ago, it's done. Let it stay done." "It was never done," Doyun said. "You just made sure I didn't know it was still happening." Something in his father's face shifted, the first real flicker of uncertainty Doyun had seen from him in years. Doyun didn't wait for the scheduled remarks. He walked to the front of the hall himself, in front of two families who had gathered to witness a marriage that was never going to happen, and asked for everyone's attention in a voice that carried without needing to be raised. "Before this evening goes any further," he said, "there's a truth this family owes several people in this room, and one family who isn't in this room yet, though I'm hoping they'll join us." Whispers moved through the hall like weather. Seokmin's expression hardened into something between fury and panic, an expression few people present had ever seen on him. 15 years ago," Doyun continued, "I loved a woman named Imani Carter. She was pregnant with my sons when two men convinced her, on the same night, within the same hour, that leaving Korea and disappearing was the only way to protect me from prison and protect our children from a war neither of them had any part in starting." He held up the file Ren had assembled. "One of those men worked for my father, who paid to relocate her under a false story that I had chosen an arranged marriage over her. The other worked for Ha-jun-oh, who threatened her with fabricated evidence that I would be imprisoned if she stayed. Two men, from two sides of a conflict that had nothing to do with her, agreed, without ever needing to discuss it directly, that it served both their interests to make her disappear." Seokmin stepped forward, his voice low and urgent in a way it rarely was. "Doyun, think about what you're doing to this family's name." "I am thinking about this family," Doyun said. "I'm thinking about the two grandsons you've never met because you decided their mother was a liability instead of a person. I'm thinking about 15 years I can't get back, and the 15 more I refuse to lose the same way." He gestured, and Ren stepped forward with the two former employees, both of whom, under the weight of Doyun's authority and the promise of protection from any retaliation, confirmed in front of the entire hall exactly what they'd processed 15 years ago, and on whose orders. The room had gone completely silent by the time Doyun turned toward the back of the hall, toward Imani, who was already standing, already walking forward with her sons on either side of her, no longer hiding from a room full of people who had spent 15 years never knowing she existed. "This is Imani Carter," Doyun said, his voice unsteady for the first time all evening. "And these are my sons, Malik and Kofi. I should have introduced them to this family 15 years ago. I'm doing it now, in front of everyone, because I'm done letting anyone decide what stays hidden." Beek stepped forward next, addressing her own family directly. "There will be no wedding tonight or any night. I've known for weeks this arrangement wasn't going to happen, and I've spent that time helping uncover the truth instead of pretending it wasn't relevant to me. I'd ask my family to accept that and to consider what it says about the Kang family's conduct that we're only learning this 15 years too late." Kang Seokmin stood frozen at the front of the hall, watching 15 years of careful control collapse in front of every guest whose respect he'd spent decades cultivating, and understood, in real time, that there was no version of tonight that ended with his authority intact. He wasn't the only one whose evening had just been destroyed. 2 blocks away, Ha-jun-oh received a call from someone inside the hall the moment Doyun mentioned his name publicly, and understood immediately that the leverage he'd protected for 15 years had just evaporated in front of witnesses who couldn't be silenced or brought back into ignorance. He made one final decision, reckless in a way 15 years of careful patience had never allowed him to be, and gave an order to move on Imani's family that same night, before the exposure in that hall could translate into consequences he couldn't outrun. But Doyun, having learned exactly nothing carelessly this time, had already anticipated that possibility. Security he trusted personally, men with no loyalty to his father, had been stationed near Imani's apartment and near the hall itself since that afternoon. When O's people arrived near Imani's building less than an hour later, they found the building watched, the family already relocated to a secured location, and any element of surprise O had been counting on completely gone. O was arrested within the week, along with 2 of his lieutenants, on charges connected to threats made against Imani and her sons, charges built directly from the evidence Doyun and Ren had assembled, and evidence O's own men, facing prosecution themselves, were quickly willing to provide in exchange for reduced consequences. Kang Seok-min faced no criminal charges. What he faced instead, in the weeks following the ceremony, was something that cost him far more within his own world: the quiet, steady withdrawal of an organization's respect, as businessmen and allies who had feared him for decades began redirecting their loyalty toward a son who had just proven, in front of everyone, that he was willing to burn down his own advantage rather than keep protecting a lie. Back in the hall, in the middle of a room still reeling from everything it had just witnessed, Imani stood in front of Doyun with her sons beside her. 15 years of a story neither of them had chosen finally laid bare in front of the people who mattered least and the people who mattered most, all at once. "You didn't have to do that in front of everyone," she said quietly. "I did," Doyun said. "You spent 15 years being erased quietly. I wasn't going to let the truth come back the same way." Malik looked between his parents, something shifting behind his careful eyes, and for the first time since the jewelry gallery, he spoke to Doyun without being asked a question first. "That took guts," he said, "doing that in front of all these people." "It was the least I owed you," Doyun said, "all 3 of you." 6 months later, Busan looked the same from the outside, the harbor still busy, the skyline still lit gold at dusk, but very little about Doyun Kang's life resembled the one he'd been living the day he walked into Hanol Jewelry to buy a ring for a marriage he never wanted. Kang Seok-min had stepped back from daily leadership of the organization by then, not by choice, but by the accumulated weight of an inner circle that no longer trusted his judgment the way it once had. He and Doyun spoke occasionally, careful conversations that hadn't yet found their way to forgiveness, though Doyun had started bringing the boys to see their grandfather once a month, not because Seok-min had earned it yet, but because Doyun believed his sons deserved the choice of whether that relationship was worth building, rather than having it decided for them the way his own life once had been. Hajun O's trial concluded that spring, with a sentence long enough that his name stopped appearing in conversations about Busan's rival factions altogether. The organization he'd built fractured within months of his arrest, absorbed piece by rivals who had been waiting years for exactly this kind of opening. Doyun had spent those 6 months doing something his father's entire life had never modeled for him, showing up consistently without demanding anything in return. He picked the boys up from school some afternoons, not to impress them, just to be present for the ordinary parts of their lives he'd missed for 15 years. He learned that Malik wanted to study engineering and had strong opinions about which universities were worth the tuition. He learned that Kofi had a talent for photography he'd been too shy to show anyone outside his immediate family. He learned, slowly, the specific rhythm of being someone's father instead of merely being related to them. Imani watched all of it with the same careful attention she'd carried for 15 years, though the caution in her had softened into something closer to hope with each passing month. "You could have gone back to managing everything from a distance," she told him one evening, watching him help Kofi carry photography equipment up to her apartment. "Most men in your position would have." "I already lost 15 years managing things from a distance," Doyun said. "I'm not interested in finding out what that costs me a second time." They hadn't rushed anything, not the boy's trust, not each other's. Doyun had asked her 3 months after the ceremony if she'd consider letting him earn back what 15 years had taken, not all at once, not with promises he couldn't guarantee, just with time honestly spent. She'd told him she needed to see it, not hear it, and he had spent every week since proving he understood the difference. On a warm evening in early autumn, the four of them sat together on Imani's balcony, the same balcony where Malik had once asked his mother if she planned to run again. Kofi was showing Doyun photographs on his camera, explaining composition with the patient enthusiasm of someone finally being asked real questions about something he cared about. Malik sat beside his mother, quieter, watching his father listen to his brother with genuine attention rather than obligation. "You know," Malik said to her, low enough that only she could hear, "I used to think having a father meant having someone who told you what to do. I don't think that's actually it." "What do you think it is?" "Someone who shows up, even when nobody's making him." Imani looked out over the same skyline she'd once fled in the middle of the night, believing she was protecting the very people now laughing quietly beside her, and felt something in her chest finally settle after 15 years of carrying a story that had never fully belonged to her. She thought about everything the last 6 months had cost and everything it had returned. She thought about a promise made by a river 15 years ago and how long it had taken and how completely it had finally been kept. "I spent 15 years believing love wasn't enough to survive what was standing in the way of it," she said quietly. "I'm starting to think I was wrong. It just needed the truth standing beside it." Doyun looked over at that moment, catching the tail end of what she'd said, and reached for her hand the way he used to by the harbor when they were young enough to believe nothing could take that from them. This time, nothing did. If this story meant something to you, if you found yourself holding your breath through that gallery, or that kitchen table at 2 in the morning, or that hall where 15 years of silence finally broke apart in front of everyone who mattered, let us know in the comments. Tell us which moment hit hardest. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, because there's always another story waiting, another family finding its way back to the truth it lost. Thank you for staying until the end. We'll see you in the next one.